everyone. Welcome to the January 3rd, 2023 edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and the Pacecast is back in the new year. We promised that we'd bring it back after taking a little bit of a hiatus in the month of December. I think the last Pacecast we did was back in late November, so we've had a number of weeks off, but happy to get back to recapping these stakes races taking place around the country. I also want to wish all of our listeners a happy new year with at midnight a couple days ago. It is now 2023. All of the horses out there are 1 year older, so I wish everybody who listens has a prosperous new year and that everybody celebrated some nice holidays over the past few weeks. And Craig, I'm just itching to get back into our conversations because it's been a while since we've done this.
Yeah, we haven't had a Pacecast in a while. We threw in a forecast or two over the time, but there was some good racing to talk about over the holidays. Some stretching all the way back to the day after Christmas, which came on a Monday this year. So looking forward to it. It's always fun. It's kind of the official time to get the Derby season kicked off. We had a few prep races, so yeah, let's get back in the swing of it.
Yeah, it feels like Derby season always sneaks up on you around this time. I mean, obviously, the horses have turned 3 years old now, so they're going to start to get that speculation going, but kind of doesn't feel like it's really in full swing yet. A lot of horses still have much to prove, and we clearly haven't seen the ones that competed in last year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile back in action yet, but there's a lot of up-and-comers out there, and we'll touch upon a few of them on this show. Before Craig and I get into a discussion of last week's or the last week and a half of racing, though, we just want to take a moment to talk about the 2022, looking back at our votes for the Eclipse Awards. Those, I think, are due today, this afternoon. I know Craig and I already submitted our ballots. I saw Craig posted his on Twitter, as did I. And Craig, I wouldn't say that there were too many categories that were really up for debate. Maybe 4 or 5 of them that I think you could have gone in a few different directions, and I guess we can talk about a few of those, but all of the people's ballots who I saw posted, the Horse of the Year votes look pretty similar for a lot of people. I mean, obviously Flightline is going to be a shoo-in to win that award, and it just felt like the older male division all year long was the strongest division by far, so not surprised to see some votes for Life is Good and Olympiad because they had amazing years, but clearly nobody could measure up to Flightline.
Yeah, he's going to win the award. That was a foregone conclusion. Probably even, I guess he had to win the Breeders' Cup Classic. I shouldn't say before that. But it was almost a foregone conclusion he was going to win. He delivered, so he's clearly going to be Horse of the Year. And unfortunately, we only got to see him race 3 times. But those 3 times, I mean, you just don't see dominance like that anymore. So it was pretty special. Would have been nice if maybe he came back for another race or two. But there was no real point. I don't think there was anything left to prove. And we weren't going to see anything that we didn't already see.
Yeah, and I saw some people were asking why I didn't include Molithot in the Horse of the Year top 3. And I mean, she won 3 Grade 1s, had a really nice season, is obviously the winner in the older dirt female division. But I just thought Life is Good and Olympiad had really solid years. I mean, looking back at Life is Good's PPs, I kind of forgot that he had won that Pegasus World Cup going all the way back to January when he ran Nick's Go off his feet. And he won some pretty big races after that. The Whitney, the Woodward, I mean, was the horse that basically asked Flightline to run that fast speed figure in the Breeders' Cup Classic by pushing him so hard in the early portion of that race. So wanted to give him a shout out. And Olympiad just had the 1 Grade 1 victory in the Jockey Club Gold Cup. But I mean, he was rock solid from the beginning of the year all the way to the end when he finished second in the Breeders' Cup. So wanted to give a mention to both of those runners, but not a lot of debate in those divisions.
No, in the Horse of the Year category, I went a little bit differently. I didn't really want to pick the older horses second and third, and I have no argument with those that did, but I just thought they were so far behind Flightline. I went the Molithot route and did a little different for third. I thought Forte had one of the better 2-year-old seasons we've seen in a while, so I picked him for third.
Yeah, he had a really solid season. 3 Grade 1 victories. I know he wasn't the most highly regarded horse coming into that Breeders' Cup Juvenile, but he certainly exited as one of the more accomplished juvenile champions that we've seen over the past number of years. So can't really argue with that too hard. It's just a different philosophy going with horses from different divisions in that Horse of the Year category. And Craig, there were a few equine categories that you could debate a little bit. For me, I thought the toughest one to make a decision was the female turf horse category, where you had 2 Chad Brown, Peter Brandt runners that I thought were really deserving in Italian and Regal Glory. I think Regal Glory had one more Grade 1 victory. In Italian was the one who showed up and ran the better race on Breeders' Cup Day when she was a very good second in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf. I think they faced off twice. They traded decisions, 1 win for an Italian, 1 win for Regal Glory. So that one for me was kind of a toss-up. I did give it to In Italian, though, the horse that showed up on Breeders' Cup Day and really finished off her season strongly.
Yeah, and I promise I didn't look at your votes beforehand. I saw you had posted them because I actually did my voting yesterday. But we came up with the same horses. It was a very close call, and I would even add in Warlike Goddess. I think she was pretty close behind, particularly given she ran well against males in her last 2 starts. But the more I dug into the resume, she just didn't quite stack up with the other 2. And for me, it was, like I said, it was basically a 1 and 1A, and the deciding factor was the performance on Breeders' Cup Day.
Yeah, there's an argument Warlike Goddess is the most talented of those 3 horses, but the past couple of years, they've just campaigned her in a way that made her have to win the Breeders' Cup to get an Eclipse Award, because they just ran a lot of Grade 2 and Grade 3 events, campaigned her pretty lightly, not putting forth a full year's campaign. And when you don't win your primary objective in that situation, it makes it hard to reward you at the end of the year. So I agree. Even though I wanted to build a case for Warlike Goddess like you, I couldn't quite get there. We also agreed in another tough category, male sprinter. This one, I guess you can make a case for 3 different horses. Elite Power, the Breeders' Cup Sprint winner, Jackie's Warrior, the beaten favorite in the Breeders' Cup for the 2nd year in a row, but he did have a strong first half of the season, so I guess I understand why some people want to go back to him, although I kind of have trouble wrapping my head around him being a 2-time sprint champion, having lost the Breeders' Cup Sprint 2 years in a row. And then there's Cody's Wish, who only ran in 1 true sprint, and I know that matters to both you and I. It's hard to award a horse like that.
Right. I couldn't give it to Cody's Wish. He wasn't a sprinter. His 1 sprint was a 7-furlong race, and he ran very well that day to beat Jackie's Warrior, but I didn't even have him in the top 3. I went with Elite Power, Jackie's Warrior 2nd, but even that was a close call with Jack Christopher for me, who I put 3rd. I think it was unfortunate he didn't get to run in the Breeders' Cup, because I think he would have been a real horse to deal with. Had 2 very nice grade 1 wins over the summer, was clearly the dominant 3-year-old sprinter. So a shame we didn't get to see him, but you can't give him credit for a race he didn't run in, so I only came up with him 3rd, and I really don't see any way you could give it to anyone but Elite Power. He won the biggest race easily. He won the Grade 1 Vosburg. Before that, say what you will about the field, but he can't control the other horses that show up.
Yeah, for me, this was pretty easy to give to Elite Power. I mean, he did win the Vosburg, which, I know it was a soft field, but I mean, look at Jackie's Warrior. He beat a lot of soft fields in Grade 1 races this year. I mean, that Vanderbilt was kind of a joke in retrospect. And I mean, even going back to that Churchill Downs that he won earlier in the year, that was not the strongest field that we've seen. And they both got their big test in the Breeders' Cup Sprint. And Elite Power beat Jackie's Warrior fair and square. I mean, it's not like Jackie's Warrior had some big excuse like he did last year when he came out of the Breeders' Cup with an injury. It just feels like Elite Power was the better horse on the day. And for me, it was easy to give it to him, despite the fact that he did have a pretty light campaign as far as sprint champions go historically. Another category that was somewhat debated, Craig, was 3-year-old male. And once again, I think we agreed on this one. We'll talk about one of these horses just a little bit more when we get to our recap portion. But it was between Epicenter and Taba for a lot of people. Epicenter just having that 1 Grade 1 victory in the Travers. But he was the higher rated horse across his campaign, competing in really the races that you need to compete in to be 3-year-old champion. Whereas Taba, achieved achieved grade 1 victories, more of them, I think 3 in total, but in races like the Santa Anita Derby, the Pennsylvania Derby, the Malibu. Not sure if that really makes a 3-year-old champion.
I would agree. Well, I did agree. I even didn't have Teba in second, which I guess maybe I'll get a little bit of grief for. But it's for the reasons you say. He won 3 grade 1s. I'm a guy that makes speed figures, and Teba was just as fast or faster than Epicenter. He did win the 3 grade 1s, but I think it's very fair to assess the grade 1 wins and what he was beating. The Santa Anita Derby, in retrospect, was just not a good race. He ran a good race, but you can't really say much for the rest of the field. It was wound up being pretty terrible, and the Malibu was not a good field at all. So he won a grade 1 there. It was not strong. It was just a sprint race, which I do think matters. I don't think they're near as strong as some of the grade 1s we did see. So I thought his Pennsylvania Derby was very good, but for me, I couldn't even put him ahead of Modern Games, who I know has his own division, but he did very well. He obviously won a grade 1 this year over in Europe. He came here. He won one at Woodbine. He won the Breeders' Cup Mile against a decent field, including other Europeans. Not a great field, but he did everything that was asked of him. So for me, I have no argument with anybody that picked any of these 3 horses. I just went with the 3 that I thought gave the best campaign and put them in that order.
Yeah, I mean, when I went back through it, I actually was having trouble deciding between these two, and I kind of, for my own purposes, assigned point values to some of the races. I mean, obviously rating the Breeders' Cup Classic the highest, the Derby the second highest, and just kind of went down the list, deciding what I thought a first place finish was worth, what a second place finish was worth in some of these races. And as I tallied it all up, Epicenter just came out with, the more valuable points. To me, his second place finishes in the Derby and the Preakness, they've got to mean something in this year-end award discussion, and he just edged out Teba for me. It's a different philosophy, I guess, with Modern Games. I think there's a category for him. He's obviously the choice for male turf horse. He's probably going to win that award pretty easily. To me, the 3-year-old male award is more of a award for dirt horses, or just historically has been. And Modern Games, a horse from Europe, to me, it doesn't really make sense to count his European campaign when you're talking about the American 3-year-old male award. So I'm not looking at his overseas races at all when I'm evaluating Modern Games. So I mean, he didn't really factor in for me. I just feel like a horse who runs once in Canada and once in the US, even though he won the Breeders' Cup, he's not the kind of horse that I'm considering to be a 3-year-old male and male turf horse champion. To me, you've got to be an American horse and have a year-long campaign in this country to, achieve that kind of historic feat to sweep 2 awards. So he wasn't for me, but I understand why some people, are looking at a horse like that, because a win in the Breeders' Cup Mile by a 3-year-old is pretty impressive. I didn't think the other equine categories, Craig, were that tough to decide. So, I mean, we don't really have to talk about them. The others looked pretty straightforward to me. Some of the human awards, I guess you can go in a few different directions. I would say the closest one for me to make a decision was the trainer award between Todd Pletcher and Chad Brown. If you just look at the raw stats, their numbers are very even in terms of grade 1 victories. Earnings, I think Chad just barely edged out Todd in that category. I think grade 1s, he had 1 more. As I was going through my ballot, I just noticed more names from the Todd Pletcher barn in a more diverse number of categories. He has a stronger division of dirt horses, so I ended up giving it to Todd, but I could see going the other direction.
Yeah, same for me. It sounds like we were thinking along the same lines. I just like the more versatile stable that Todd Pletcher had. He was a force in more divisions than Chad Brown was, but if somebody wanted to say they should be flip-flopped, I have no problem with that. I voted Bill Mott third. I think he was a pretty distant third, but I also think he had a really, really good year, and look forward to seeing him with some of the horses he has coming back.
I completely agree with that. I mean, part of me wanted to award Bill Mott a little bit higher, but it's just hard based on the numbers to give it to him over Todd Pletcher and Chad Brown, who just have more high-level horses in their barns. But Bill Mott had an amazing year, and part of me wanted to write in Bill Mott for champion male sprinter, because it just seemed like he won all of the races in that division with horses like Speaker's Corner, Cody's Wish, Elite Power. I think I'm even forgetting one. I mean, he just had a fantastic year with his sprinters on the dirt, but just third best in terms of my top trainer award. Seems like Irad's going to win the jockey. Not a whole lot of drama there. The owner award, I went for Peter Brandt. I think you went for Godolphin. I could have flip-flopped them. I just wanted to award Peter Brandt for just totally dominating that female turf division. He had so many top runners in that division, winning grade ones and graded stakes throughout the year. It was a real tour de force for him, and just the sheer number of graded stakes wins for his barn compared to his overall starters. I think he had 10% graded stakes wins from starters. It's just insane. So I wanted to give it to Peter Brandt, but Godolphin clearly had a fantastic year as well.
Yeah, same thing. They were close calls. It could have been flip-flopped. I think the numbers probably overwhelmed me a little bit, and that was a deciding factor. But I have no problem with Peter Brandt. I put Klarovich Stables third. They had another strong year, very good stable, won lots of graded races. So it's a tough one. I will say the owner thing is getting tougher and tougher with so many groups where we just have multiple owners for so many horses, and I hope that at some point they'll come out with some better guidelines and how we're supposed to do that. Are we supposed to just treat like groups together, or are we supposed to treat small interest in horses? And I think it's a really tough category.
Yeah, that's a really good point you bring up. And as I was going through, I was noticing that Rapoli Stable, Mike Rapoli, if you count the partnerships he's involved in, he had 7 grade 1 wins last year. I mean, with horses like Nest and Mo Donegal and others. I mean, he was involved in some pretty good horses, but how much credit do you give for an owner that has 50% share of a horse or less than that? Does that count as much as a Peter Brandt who, owned fully 7 grade 1 winners? And I had trouble giving it to the part owner in that situation, so I put him third. I guess I could have had him higher. I've seen that some people did. But that's a tricky thing to evaluate in this owner category. Well, I think we've discussed all of the controversial categories at the Eclipse Awards, Greg, so let's move on to the recap section of our TimeformUS Pacecast, looking back to 2022 and also to New Year's Day 2023, as I think there is at least one stakes race we're going to discuss from this past Sunday. But let's begin by going all the way back to Boxing Day, the day after Christmas at Santa Anita, just to talk about a few of those grade 1 events that they ran on that Monday card. And we've already mentioned Taiba and his chances for the 3-year-old Eclipse Award. I guess some people might view him winning his 3rd grade 1 of the year on the Malibu as bolstering his credentials a little bit, but like we already talked about, not the strongest Malibu field in the world, and Taiba just kind of did what you'd expect him to do.
Yeah, I thought he ran fine at a distance, which probably isn't his best. He had run fine sprinting in his debut, but just the way he runs, the way he's built, he looks like a horse who the more distance, the better. So I thought it was pretty impressive he was able to handle the 7 furlongs as easily as he did, particularly seeing he ran 1.25 miles just about 6 weeks or 7 weeks before that. So good effort from him. It didn't really do much to sway me, beating Forbidden Kingdom, a horse who hadn't won since one of the early prep races for the Derby. It just wasn't a very strong field at all. So he did what he should. I'm not knocking him at all. I get why they ran him in here, trying to get the Eclipse Award, I would assume. But it just didn't quite put him over the map for me. He got a 121 TimeformUS speed figure. He had run a couple 130s routing the last couple times. And honestly, it seemed like he was just getting going in the stretch.
Yeah, he's such a funny horse because he really does not do it easily. I mean, his riders, Mike Smith, has to really get after him to achieve these results. And you could see it just out of the starting gate. Mike Smith was basically putting him into a full-out drive to get forward, which I think was the right call. With a horse like him, you don't want him to lose too much ground and take kickback and get outrun in these races. But he was just riding this horse hard for basically the final 6 furlongs of this Malibu. And on the far turn, he was all in. And I guess if you didn't know Taiba, you might be concerned at that point, but having watched all of this horse's races, he continues to respond to that pressure, and once they got into the stretch, his stamina kicked in and he was able to power away from this field. But like you said, it wasn't the most impressive performance that we've seen from him in his career, a little bit of a regression from a speed figure standpoint. Forbidden Kingdom, who was second, I thought he was game to come back for second because at the top of the stretch, it looked like he might be fading to finish off the board, but he did come back and pass the horse that had gotten by him an upper stretch and then hold off a closer like Hoist the Gold. So good effort from Forbidden Kingdom. I wonder if he's a horse that might prefer stretching out in distance in the future, especially the way that he finished this race and remembering his San Felipe from earlier in the season. I know they've concentrated on sprints since his return late in the season, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them stretch him out again over the winter at Santa Anita. And behind these two, just not a whole lot to talk about, Craig. Like you said, not really a grade 1 quality field behind Taiba, arguably Forbidden Kingdom. And I think we're going to see Taiba run next in the Saudi Cup, just given his ownership. It seems like that's the logical next step. I think the connections have mentioned that as a target, and he could face another Bob Baffert trainee that ran on this Monday card at Santa Anita when he goes over there. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But the other grade 1 at 7 furlongs was for 3-year-old fillies. The La Brea run 2 races earlier, also won by Bob Baffert with Fun to Dream, the California-bred daughter of Arrogate. And Craig, this race didn't come up that much slower than the Malibu if you take these times at face value.
Yeah, and I did. I forgot to mention that with the Malibu, but I guess this is the best time since we're bringing the others up. I get a lot of questions anytime the Beyer speed figures come out, and I got to be honest, I have no special insight into what the Beyer team did. It's obvious that they broke these races out a little bit because I think they were only a fifth of a second apart on final time. My assistant who made the speed figures for this day saw no reason to, and I happen to agree with them. I didn't see anything. The track didn't look to have changed. It was a beautiful sunny day. It wasn't a windy day, anything like that. So I just went with the clock. Fun to Dream was pretty impressive. Got a 117 speed figure. It's a big jump for her. She was a horse on the forecast that of the armada of Bob Baffert horses in the race, the one I liked the least. But she was quite live in the betting at 5-2, which I noticed right away. I thought that was a little bit interesting because she certainly had the latest credentials coming in. So it almost seemed like a they knew situation to me. And she certainly ran a big race in the La Brea.
Yeah, you and I had been on the same page about this one. I didn't like her much going into the race, but once you saw her at 5-2 and taking all that money, and there had been some buzz that she was working best of all these Bob Baffert horses, and that typically does sway people, especially in Southern California, so not surprising to see her come through with a big effort. I thought Awake at Midnight, who was second here, put in a nice performance at 7-1 to lose by just 3/4 of a length. At an upper stretch, it briefly looked like she might give Fun to Dream a real challenge, but that Bob Baffert filly just kept finding more to the inside, and they drew clear of the rest of the field. And they're two horses that had run fast numbers earlier in their careers, and I guess it's not a huge surprise that they could take these jumps up by 8 to 10 speed figure points, which is what the numbers suggest that they did here. I don't have a big problem with what you decided or what your assistant decided to do with the speed figures. It does feel like this race is maybe a tad fast, the Malibu is a tad slow, but I'm not going to quibble too much because, like you said, the rest of the day looked pretty consistent. Let's move on to next graded stakes race we'll discuss from that Monday card, or really the final graded stakes we're going to talk about. Another Bob Baffert trained winner in the Grade 2 San Antonio. That was, of course, Country Grammar. Another horse that we could see next time in the Saudi Cup or potentially the Dubai World Cup or both, as they're likely to go overseas with him. And Craig, what I liked about this performance from Country Grammar is that we saw him a little bit more engaged early in the race. He was pretty close to the pace, just looked like he was always traveling as if he was going to win the race, which hasn't always been the case with this horse. Sometimes he can be a little bit lazy in his races, and this might have been the confidence booster that he needed.
This was a very good race from him. I really liked what I saw. He ran a 124 speed figure. He did it while pretty wide all the way around the track. He was tracking what was a pretty quick pace. And at the mile and a 16th distance, that's even a faster pace than what he's used to seeing at the longer races. So I thought this was a really good effort for him and sets him up well. Unfortunately, like you said, we're probably not going to see him back in this country for a while, but good race by him. And I should also mention a good ride by Frankie Dettori, who is really fun getting to watch him at Santa Anita on a regular basis.
Yeah, he had a big day on that Monday card, delivered some excellent rides, especially in a couple of the turf races. And yeah, pretty cool to see him, especially in the twilight of his career, challenging himself by riding in Southern California through this winter for a few months. And yeah, like you said, this was a nice step in the right direction for Country Grammar. Obviously, he's going to face a much tougher field in his next couple of starts if they decide to go overseas with him, because this wasn't the strongest Grade 2 event you're ever going to see. Stiletto Boy, it was nice to see him bounce back with a competitive effort once again to be second here, but he still is not running the kind of 130 plus type of speed figures that we saw him maybe be capable of earlier last year. So step in the right direction for Stiletto Boy, but maybe not the same horse that he once was early in his 4-year-old season.
Yeah, I think the thing with Stiletto Boy, they really have to get him to the front. Whenever he's up near the front like he was here, he runs pretty well. When he's not, he just doesn't show up.
And I think Bob Baffert won 5 races in total on this Monday card, and he unveiled a pretty good-looking 2-year-old who has now since turned 3 years old in Faustin, who was the winner in a maiden race that did feature a trio of Bob Baffert first-time starters. And this one certainly looks like, of those 3, the one that is most likely to be appreciating at a distance with a lot of potential as they go longer in the future. This son of Curlin just made a nice, sustained run from off the pace. Did get some fast fractions to close into, but did everything the way you want to see a horse win that likely to stretch out in the future.
I like what I saw from Faustin. I thought it was impressive. Not that it's surprising. He was the favorite of the Bob Baffert 3 horses. But it looked like his stablemate, Sonoran, had gotten away from him and was maybe going to be able to hold him off. But in that last 3/16 of a mile or so, Faustin just found another gear and ran right by him. So I haven't looked at his breeding, but sure seemed like a horse that would probably do fine going further.
Yeah, it's an excellent pedigree. I mean, like I said, he's by Curlin. He gets that gray color from his dam, Hard Not to Like, who was a very good turf horse. I want to say she was trained for at least part of her career by Christophe Clement. She won the Grade 1 Diana. I think she won the Jenny Wiley. She was a really good horse in the early 2010s. And Faustin definitely seems like he's got the pedigree to go longer distances, even though this just was a 6-furlong debut. And I'm glad you mentioned the runner-up Sonoran, who does have much more of a sprint pedigree, especially on the dam side, but I thought he ran really well in defeat. In the teeth of that fast pace, put away the other speeds, and obviously got run down by his stablemate, but that 105 TimeformUS speed figure that he got in his debut is nothing to sneeze at.
No, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Faustin ran a 106, so I think there's definitely some room to grow with him. It's not one of the flashier figures we see some of Bob Baffert's 2-year-olds run, but it's nothing to sneeze at either. It was a good, strong effort.
So a few more graded stakes run at Santa Anita this past Saturday. The Grade 2 Joe Hernandez, I think, was the highest rated of those. It went as the first race of the day down the hill on the turf course. And Air Force Red, Craig, got the job done here, earning the highest speed figure that I think we saw from this card at Santa Anita. And this race really was won in the opening quarter mile, and they let him get away with a nearly 22-1 opening quarter. Really hard to catch a speed horse of quality when they get away with that kind of fraction down the hill.
Yeah, it sounds kind of funny to say that, but I mean, we've seen fractions sub 21 going down the hill at times, and Air Force Red's a horse who's proven to really like the hill. He's had a lot of success, and he's just been steadily improving his speed figures, getting better and better every time out. He's a newly turned 5-year-old, so I don't think he's going anywhere. He ran a very good 121 speed figure in this effort, so if you let him get away, especially on that hill, he's trouble, but he's also pretty versatile. He had won a stakes race last time out at a mile, so I wouldn't rule him out if he shows up at a longer distance either.
Yeah, given the amount of racing that there's been over the past couple of weeks, we can't talk about every graded stakes race. There were some other nice performances from this card later in the day that they ran the Joe Hernandez at Santa Anita last week. But let's move on to another venue, Fairgrounds, where they began their winter season on December 26th, Boxing Day, the same day that they ran the Malibu. And the feature that day was the Diliberto Memorial on the turf, finally getting to use that Fairgrounds turf turf course after there had been some problems with it when they initially began their fall meet back at the end of November. And Craig, Spooky Channel, a horse that we hadn't seen in over a year. I think it had been 14 months since his last race and his last victory. Came off the long layoff to get the job done here and looked like he didn't miss a beat.
He did not. He got a very good speed figure of 126. I will be the first to say it was a very difficult speed figure to make. There was another turf race on the card earlier in the day, a stakes race for fillies and mares that was run at the exact same distance on the exact same course. I did split them a little bit because had I not, Spooky Channel would have been in the 130s, and I don't think that's very realistic. I was not as conservative as maybe I could have been, but it was a very good effort. I mean, it's not like he's not a horse who had been running consistent 120 speed figures in the past. He just hadn't quite reached that 126. But this is one I'm going to keep an eye on. Maybe it should be 3 or 4 points lower, but it was a very tough day. One thing I'll say, it's ridiculous that the fairgrounds called this turf course firm. It was soft, basically, when you look at the TimeformUS track condition ratings. There's no way it was a firm turf course.
I think it was firm. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it the case that at fairgrounds, they time the races as if it's being run at 0 feet, even when the rail is out? So with the rail being at 34 feet, I think that explains why the times were so slow. I don't think they typically use a rail setting that's that far out. So, you could see when you watch the race, the really slow fractions are when they're running around the turns. So I kind of get the sense that's why the time was so slow for this race.
That is true. That's how they time the races, but it doesn't make that much of a difference. I would say, okay, maybe the 2 is a little bit exaggerated, but it's more like a 5 at most. Running that far out, it's not going to make so much of a difference that it would have been like an 8 or a 9. It was maybe a good course at best.
Well, as we know from watching turf racing around the country, the stated track conditions mean very little, which is why tools like the track condition ratings that you see in TimeformUS are so useful, because a firm at one course can be yielding at another course, or another track, I should say. It's hard to make those comparisons. Craig, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to, lodge some of those questions about this number for Spooky Channel, because 126, that's like a grade 1 level number, and I'm not sure this race overall was quite that good. Even though Spooky Channel is a really nice horse, I'm not sure that he ran that kind of number off the layoff. The third place finisher, Big Agenda, he's like a 25 claimer. I'm not really sure that I can buy him getting a 120, and the beaten favorite in this race, Gentle Soul, I mean, we have him getting a career best number, even though he clearly didn't run his race here. So I've got a little bit of trouble with this, but you got to give it up to Spooky Channel. I mean, he has been just rock solid since basically the end of 2019 when they first got him on the turf. I think he was running at Turf Paradise at the time, and he's gone through a few different barns since then. I think now he's with Jason Barkley. But I mean, to get this horse back to his best off this kind of layoff and now winning his 3rd race in a row with the win streak starting all the way back in the summer of 2021, he's a pretty cool horse.
Yeah, he became a favorite of mine when I got to see him win at Remington Park. I think it was on Oklahoma Derby Day back in 2021. He won the Remington Green Stakes impressively. So became a fan of his. He went away for a while, but something I know both of us have mentioned on our shows in the past, latch on to these older turf runners because they stick around and we get to see them over and over again.
The race that was run right after the Diliberto Memorial was the Gun Runner, one of many stakes they ran on this Monday card at Fairgrounds. This one, a very early Derby prep. I think the local prep for the Lecomte, which is itself a prep for many races down the Fairgrounds Triple Crown Trail. But the winner of this Gun Runner was the Brad Cox trained Jace's Road, and Brad Cox did have a pretty big week with his 3-year-olds. We'll talk about a few of them on this Pacecast. And Jace's Road, a horse that had kind of put forth this inexplicably poor effort in his prior start in this street sense, but bounced back here as if something, whatever had gone wrong that day, they figured it out and corrected it. And he took a big step forward from a speed figure standpoint here to get a 111.
Yeah, this was a big race, and it was a day where they ran plenty of route races at the fairgrounds. It wasn't a very difficult speed figure to make, in my opinion, so I think the 111's pretty legit. The only thing I could come up with last race, it was a sloppy track. Maybe he just didn't handle it. But if you throw that one out, he's progressed nicely each time out and looks like a very serious 3-year-old based on the 111 number here.
Yeah, the horse that went off as the heavy favorite in this race was Determinedly, who was the 4-5 favorite after having impressively won a maiden race at Churchill Downs back at the end of November. Maybe a little bit overbet off the visual impression that race left because the speed figure didn't come back that fast, and he did stumble at the start here, but you could see he was just never traveling as well as Jace's Road, who was in hand when they got to the top of the stretch, and once he was set down by Florent Giroux, he just drew away from this field. And you're not going to have to run that much faster than a 111 to win a lot of preps on this road to the Derby, Craig. So interesting to see if this horse is able to progress further from here. Brad Cox sent out another good one earlier on this Fairgrounds card, going a shorter distance in the Sugar Bowl Stakes for the 3-year-old males at 6 furlongs. Corona Bolt is now 2 for 2 after winning this race pretty impressively. Fast final time figure here, Craig, but this one got knocked down a little bit because this horse did get away with a pretty slow pace.
Yeah, he was going pretty slow early, but wound up with a 114 final time figure, knocked down to a 106. And I think that actually kind of fits here. Not only was he going slow, he was doing it all by himself. Wasn't really challenged. There wasn't a lot of competition in here. He was 2-5, but it's not like his stablemate who ran second was a snail coming in. He had run a 98 last time out, a 94 the time before that, and backed it up with a 98 again. So Distorted Pro, I'm not sure, or Corona Bolt, I should say, is one. I'm not sure how far he wants to go, but he certainly looks like a very good sprinter.
For sure. I'm not sure about that either with regard to distance and stamina. His half-brother is Proven Strategies, who is a turf miler. Obviously, Corona Bolt is by Bolt Doro, given that name. And we're still learning about the Bolt Doros, how far they're going to want to go. I think we'll see a lot more from them stretching out this year. He did have a lot of success with his 2-year-old sprinting this past year, but that's not always indicative of a sire with distance limitations. We saw that with Gunrunner. He had a lot of precocious 2-year-olds that ultimately did stretch out. So we'll see what we get from the Bolt Doros and with his 3-year-olds this year. But Corona Bolt definitely has started off his career the right way for Brad Cox. Let's move on to Gulfstream Park, where this past weekend, I believe on Saturday, they ran a number of graded stakes races, preps for that Pegasus World Cup Day, which will be run in about a month's time. We'll talk about a few of these horses and how they might do moving on to that, which those races probably aren't going to come up as tough as they have in some past years, just given some retirements that we've already heard about following the Breeders' Cup. But seems like Skippy Longstocking, Craig, who won the Harlan's Holiday Grade 3 event, the feature race this past Saturday at Gulfstream Park, he could be pretty tough in a race like the Pegasus World Cup if he comes back with another performance like this, because he beat some nice horses here, including Simplification, who had run well in a lot of 3-year-old stakes this past year, the Derby, going through the Pennsylvania Derby, and Skippy Longstocking, a horse who on occasion had run some big speed figures, had kind of had trouble putting back-to-back races together, or I should say his best efforts back-to-back. But Skippy Longstocking definitely came through with one of his better performances here.
Yeah, I know he's a horse we were both kind of fans of. He kept showing up and running in all the dances. Finally seemed to run out of steam in the Pennsylvania Derby. The connections backed off of him, and boy, did he come back looking good. He ran a 125 TimeformUS speed figure in the win, and it's kind of interesting because it's a Pegasus this year where I'm kind of wondering who are going to be the horses that actually show up and compete, and he certainly looks like one that would be dangerous based on this effort.
I do have some questions about the time of this race. I don't know if this is the one that you timed from video or one that you've earmarked to do it, but it's just the final 16th seems like it has to be wrong. There's no way these horses came home in 6 flat, just given what we typically see in these mile and a 16th races at Gulfstream with the short stretch and them coming off the turn. You just don't see closing fractions like that. And this race did earn a speed figure that seems a little bit high. So I was just, maybe not for Skippy Longstocking, but for a few others in here. So just wondering a little bit about that. But obviously, he ran well to win this race. And just given what's out there, what's left out there, there. A lot of these horses that, were so impressive in 2022, they're not coming back for, their 4-year-old or 5-year-old season. So we're probably not going to see one of the stronger Pegasus World Cups that we've, been treated to over the past several years. And, Skippy Longstocking should be pretty competitive in a race like that.
Yeah, it's one I'll definitely take a look at. What I'll say is the timing at Gulfstream now has switched to GPS, and they use portable beams. So the final times are taken by beam. So I'm almost certain that one's right. I'll give it a look. What is not done is the fractions are done by GPS, and they can have some margin of error in there. So it's possible that last fraction is off a little bit, but I'll certainly take a look at it.
Yeah, the disappointment in this race, I guess, was O'Connor, who probably was a little bit overbet to be 6-5 in here. He had been very impressive winning his U.S. debut when he had come from Chile with a nice reputation, and obviously coming into Safi Joseph's barn, there were expectations here, and he really didn't run that much worse than he had in his allowance victory from October, but just ran into some tougher rivals who were ready to take a step forward.
Yeah, I thought he was definitely overbet, I would say. His speed figure in his win here in the U.S. equaled Skippy Longstocking's 9th place finish in the Pennsylvania Derby, so that one was a little perplexing. I would say that another disappointment was Simplification, a horse who we had seen some good things from a 3-year-old. As a 3-year-old, didn't really run very well in the Breeders' Cup, but Dirt Mile when he finished 7th. Was looking for a bounce back, and I mean he ran okay, but I would imagine Sano expected more from him.
Let's move on to another prep for a Pegasus race, the Fort Lauderdale, the local prep for the Pegasus World Cup Turf. And I think it's another situation, Craig, where maybe that race is not going to come up as strong as we've seen in some past years, although some of the Pegasus Turfs that we've already seen have barely been grade 1 quality. But City Man, even though he's just a New York bred and maybe wasn't thought of as a graded stakes level runner for much of his career, boy, has he gotten into some strong form over the past half a season or so. Beginning with that Forbidden Apple victory at Saratoga, he has now won 4 of his last 5 starts, with the one loss being a 2nd place finish. He's now won 3 in a row, and this win in the Fort Lauderdale, I mean, there's not a whole lot to knock about it. He did get a great trip coming up the inside, but beat a solid field, and the field for the Pegasus Turf might not come up that much tougher than this race.
No, it was a really strong effort from him. He's run 120 speed figures in the past. He ran a 122 here. Great ride from Joel Rosario, who just kept him up pretty close to what was a reasonable pace. It was solid, not a slow win, not overly fast. He just had him tucked in and found room and shot up the inside and was able to get clear. So good effort by the horse, good effort by the rider. And like you say, I'm not sure what there is that's going to show up for that Pegasus Turf. The horse that I think most people would have assumed 2-time winner of that race, Colonel Liam, was in this field. And he just didn't really show up. I guess you can give him an excuse for coming off the layoff and not being fully cranked. He had a tough post, so I don't want to totally write him off, but he looked pretty flat on, I think this race was run Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, it was a tough post position, but I thought he got a pretty good trip, all things considered, from Irad. And I mean, he's a horse that has run well fresh in the past. Arguably, he's run some of his best races when he's fresh off a layoff. So concerning that he wasn't able to do it here. And clearly, Craig, this is a horse that has had some physical issues. You don't, lay a horse up when he's seemingly in great form like he was after winning the Pegasus World Cup. Or I should say, when he, after won a couple of grade 1 races in 2021, and then after he won the Pegasus World Cup earlier in 2022. I mean, he's had some big breaks in his career, and maybe it's finally catching up with him when he tried to come off yet another year-long layoff here. Maybe he's just not able to recapture that top form now that he's at the age of 6. So we'll see if they run Colonel Liam back in a race like the Pegasus World Cup Turf, but he's going to have to do a lot better than he did in this Fort Lauderdale last Saturday. There were a couple of grade 3 events on that Gulfstream card, both run at 7 furlongs for the older horses, and the one that had the slower final time was the Mr. Prospector for the males, but you might notice a difference in speed figures if you compare them to, let's say, the Buyers, and that's because of different pace situations. And Sibelius, who won the Mr. Prospector, even though he ran slower than Frank's Rocket in the Sugar Swirl, the pace of the Mr. Prospector was much faster, and Sibelius, being right up on the pace the entire way is going to get that upgrade.
Right, the final time figures match the times, but Sibelius got a 1:18 final time, but the pace was much quicker, all the fractions in red, so that was boosted up to a 1:23, and I thought it was a good effort by him. He was a horse who disappointed a bit at Keeneland in the Phoenix, enough so that he wasn't tried in the Breeders' Cup. He ran okay at Churchill after that, but seemed like he really took to the Churchill surface and looked like a horse who could be a force in, who knows what there is in the sprint division this year. It's way too early to say, but that 1:23 speed figure he ran here is basically as good as we saw from most of the sprinters last year.
Yeah, and I don't really have a big problem with that pace upgrade because he did, press a strong pace the entire way. Others who were right up on there, they kind of fell away at the end. The third place finisher, Steel Sunshine, came from out of the clouds to complete the trifecta, so kind of does make some sense. And like you said, he's a horse that, had been a little bit disappointing in a couple of stakes tries in Kentucky, but he had gotten into great form prior to that, running some big speed figures at Saratoga and Pimlico, and looks like he was finally able to put forth that kind of effort at the graded stakes level. So if he can do that again, like you said, he's going to be a major force in this sprint division. I think we are going to get horses like Elite Power and Cody's Wish staying in training, so maybe the sprint division does have some strength to it coming out of the Bill Mott barn. But I mean, a lot of these races that we've seen in the sprint division over the past couple of years, they end up coming up a little bit thinner than you might expect. So a horse like Sibelius, if he's able to hold this kind of form, could have a big year. The other stakes going that 7 furlong distance for the fillies and mares was the Sugar Swirl, and like I already mentioned, was won by Frank's Rocket. With faster final time, slower early pace, that accounts for the lower TimeformUS speed figure. But Craig, I wouldn't take anything away from this horse. I mean, she's been in great form really for the entire year. Something obviously went awry. She didn't get the trip in the Breeders' Cup, but if you draw a line through that performance, she has just been ticking off these 120 plus TimeformUS speed figures, and happy to see them finally get back to some aggressive tactics with her here.
Yeah, she's a horse I know we both like to take shots against. She seemed to have trouble finding the winner's circle, but she's a horse I remember really liking what I saw when she lost to Kamari after a terrible start. Seemed like she turned a corner that day. Has really gotten more competitive, and this is a race, it was early in the card, so I missed it. I have to be honest, had I seen the 4 to 5 odds on her, that seemed like an overlay, and that's something I am very reluctant to say ever, but she just really towered over this field on paper. She towered over it on the track, winning by more than a dozen lengths, so really impressive effort by her. And the one thing that just really sticks out with her is she's a machine. She just keeps showing up, keeps running good race after good race. Even when she wasn't winning, she was always competitive. So I'm glad to have her back and look forward to seeing her back in some of the top races, because I think she's a different horse than we had saw a couple years ago.
Yeah, and I believe I misspoke. This race was 6 furlongs, whereas the Mr. Prospector was 7 furlongs. And, when you see a slower half-mile fraction at the 6 furlongs compared to the 7 furlong race, that's why you're going to see a difference in the pace upgrades and downgrades between these two races. But, yeah, Frank's Rocket, Craig, I mean, I agree. We've been skeptical of her in the past, but, I mean, not so anymore. She has just been putting forth the kinds of speed figures that we hadn't seen from her earlier in her career, and just feels like she really has, reached her peak finally, and I hope that they do keep her in training as a 6-year-old. I mean, sometimes, they'll run these horses until they intend to breed them. I hope they do commit to a full 6-year-old campaign for her, because the kind of form that she's in, she could have a really big year. And, looking back through her past performances, I know that they've tried to rate her on a few occasions. I think she's had some riders on her back previously that have been a little bit more inclined to rate her, but Luis Saez, I mean, he was aggressive on her, and it really paid off. When you look through her past performances, when she gets to the front, she rarely is passed. I mean, when they send her to the lead, she typically wins these races, and you could see on the front end, she had her ears pricked, was doing it easily, like she just loved being out there. So looking forward to a big year from Frank's Rocket, assuming she stays in training. And let's move on to a couple of other venues. We're going to talk about 2 more stakes races, both for the previous 2-year-olds / newly turned 3-year-olds, beginning with the Smarty Jones, which was run on Sunday, New Year's Day, January 1st. Victory Formation, yet another promising runner from the Brad Cox barn. This one also undefeated, now 3 for 3 in his career, and probably didn't get the sternest test here, wasn't meeting the best field in the world, Craig, but just continues to check off the boxes and win these races.
Yeah, it's very nice effort from him. Another speed figure improvement. He went from a 98 on debut to a 102 to a 109 for this race. He did it from the outside post. Not sure it mattered too much because he just seemed to be a little bit better than these horses. He got good position outside of Joe King Way, who was setting the pace. Took over. He did get a little fight from Two Eagles River. Actually, I'm looking at the wrong race. My apologies. He didn't get much of a fight. That's what confused me there because I remember watching it. He just kind of coasted to the lead, went wire to wire, ran that nice 109, and not sure what the future holds. It seems like everybody's starting out earlier and earlier with these Derby preps. There's going to be more to go. The Smarty Jones used to be in late January. I am curious what you think about his breeding. Certainly seems like going long won't be a problem from him being by Taprit out of a Smart Strike mare.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Taprit's a first crop sire, so we're still learning a little bit about him, but him being a Belmont Stakes winner, you would think that more distance not going to be a problem. Victory Formation is a half-brother to Bellamore, who was a grade 1 place turf router, so definitely pedigree for this one to continue on as the distances stretch out. And have liked everything that I've seen from him. It hasn't had to endure the toughest trip so far in his career, particularly not in this Smarty Jones victory, but he's been clearing the hurdle so far, so we'll see what we get from him when these races get a little tougher in the future. And Craig, one of the highest speed figures that we saw from any of these, 2-year-olds turning 3 was in the Hef Stakes at Laurel last Friday, December 30th, as Coffee with Chris caused a pretty big upset here, winning at 16-1 over the 7 furlong distance and earning a really nice 111 TimeformUS speed figure.
Yeah, that speed figure surprised me when it popped up on the list, and I actually did the Laurel figures for this day. It caused me to go back and look at it. It was as straightforward a day as you'll ever see variant-wise. That just every race was within a point or two on the projected variant, so it seems to fit. Not sure where this race came from. It was a pretty big jump, but these are, well, he was still a 2-year-old at the time and lately raced 3-year-olds, so you are going to see some of these jumps. And watching the race visually, I have no problem with the figure. He was very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, drifted well off the inside in the stretch. That probably was the place to be at Laurel and just kept on. I mean, the heavy favorite, Prince of Jericho, took a run at him in upper stretch, and Coffee with Chris just turned that horse away and was moving best at the finish line. So maybe more distance is going to benefit this horse. We'll see. I have not done a deep dive into his pedigree, so I can't really speak to that, but this was the first time this horse was ever crossing the wire first. He's a pretty experienced runner. I think he's already run 7 or 8 times, but he had gotten promoted to his maiden victory via disqualification. So finally getting his first, actual victory when they, crossed the finish line here. And Coffee with Chris, definitely one that's heading in the right direction. And I should note that in his prior race, he had finished 3rd behind a horse that we haven't yet discussed on this Pacecast named Post Time, who might be the best of any of these Maryland-based 2-year-olds who are now turning 3. Hasn't run quite as fast as Coffee with Chris, but he easily beat that horse in his prior start when they were going that same 7 furlong distance in the mud in the Maryland Juvenile Stakes. And that is a Maryland-bred runner for Brittany Russell, who's got a really cool story around him, and I'm sure we'll talk about him on one of these shows pretty soon.
Yeah, he's one I hope he shows up because he's looked super impressive every single time he's been on the track.
Well, Craig, that wraps up the recap portion of this TimeformUS Pacecast and the podcast for this week. We will this week be getting back to our normal schedule of 2 podcasts per week, so we'll be returning with a TimeformUS forecast on Friday. And Craig, I haven't really looked ahead too far to see what we could handicap. I know that the Aqueduct card could be coming up pretty nice on Saturday because they had to cancel their stakes race from last Saturday, so they're going to have both the Queens County and the Jerome being run, the Jerome being one of those early Derby preps on Saturday. So maybe we'll take a look at that, but we'll see what else is out there for this upcoming Saturday card to handicap on the forecast.
Yeah, I haven't looked ahead either. Aqueduct's always fine with me. I'm kind of open for anything. So I'm just glad that it's good to have the freshening that we did. There wasn't a whole lot of top-level racing between the Breeders' Cup and the coming back from Christmas on Malibu Day. But it's going to come at us fast and heavy now. So really looking forward to it. Going to see some good horses and a lot of new faces that we're not familiar with, because most of the top horses were from last year we're not going to see this year. So looking forward to what horses are going to emerge from the older division and what 3-year-olds are going to step up.
Definitely a lot to look forward to in 2023 on the horse racing landscape, and we'll cover it all on these TimeformUS podcasts, which you can always find on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel and check out all of the videos and podcasts that we put out for the listeners. So everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Friday.